The following is a passage from the writings of Abdu'l-Bahá. My name is Abdu'l-Bahá. My qualification is Abdu'l-Bahá. My reality is Abdu'l-Bahá. My praise is Abdu'l-Bahá. Thraldom to the blessed perfection is my glorious and refulgent diadem, and servitude to all the human race my perpetual religion. No name, no title, no mention, no commendation have I, nor will ever have, except Abdu'l-Bahá. This is my longing. This is my greatest yearning. This is my eternal life. This is my everlasting glory. So today our speaker is Ms. Layli Miller-Muro, and she'll be talking about learning leadership lessons from Abdu'l-Bahá. Layli Miller-Muro is a mother of three and founded and served as the Chief Executive Officer of the Tahirih Justice Center for over 20 years. Tahirih is a nonprofit organization dedicated to protecting immigrant women, girls, and other survivors from human rights abuses. She led the organization in its service to over 31,000 women and girls. In recognition of its sound management and innovative programs under Layli's leadership, Tahirih won the Washington Post Award for Management Excellence, and its innovative use of pro bono attorneys to quintuple its resources was featured in the Stanford Social Innovation Review. Layli was included in Goldman Sachs' 2012 inaugural list of the top 100 most innovative entrepreneurs and named by Newsweek Magazine as one of the 150 most fearless women in the world. So with that, I'm happy to hand it off to Layli.
Thank you so much. It's nice to be back and to share some thoughts. I'll be talking about Abdu'l-Bahá as a leadership example. We know that leadership has evolved over time, and the shape that leadership or management has taken throughout humanity's history in very similar ways has mirrored the evolution of religions. And so, as you know, the Baha'i faith believes in the progressive evolution of humankind, very similar to a child that grows and matures through different stages of physical, emotional, intellectual, and spiritual maturity. As children grow and develop from stages of infancy and childhood and adolescence and adulthood, they require different kinds of management and different kinds of leadership. Leadership or management or parenting that is more supportive or more controlling. And of course, when a child is younger, it needs a little bit more direction. And when they're older, they have a greater capacity to reason and make decisions for themselves. And so parenting has to evolve. And it's similar with organizations, and it's similar with the prophets of God as well. And so as the Baha'i faith embraces all religions as being divine and from God, we also acknowledge that each religion was relevant to the culture, the time, and the maturity stage of humanity at that particular moment in humanity's evolution. And so the manifestations of God or the prophets taught in ways that were relevant, similar to, I've mentioned management or parenting, but it's similar also to teaching. Teachers need to teach younger children differently than they teach older children. And so the manifestations of God, the divine teachers given to us over time by God, whether they be Abraham, Moses, Zoroaster, Muhammad, Christ, Buddha, or Baha'u'llah, all of those teachers taught humanity in different ways. And so styles of leadership, styles of teaching, styles of management have all evolved and changed throughout time. And so as we look to what a future style of leadership might be and what we might want to reflect in our own lives, Abdu'l-Bahá serves as a wonderful example of that. Abdu'l-Bahá is the son of the prophet founder of the Baha'i faith, Baha'u'llah. Abdu'l-Bahá is his son. Now, Baha'u'llah, when he would refer to Abdu'l-Bahá in public spaces, even within their home, he would call him the master. And he did this even when Abdu'l-Bahá was a very young child. And, for Baha'u'llah, it was a sign of respect and acknowledgement of the incredible qualities that Abdu'l-Bahá had. Ironically, and very true to who Abdu'l-Bahá was, Abdu'l-Bahá insisted on a title of the servant. And so rather than the master, which was what Baha'u'llah referred to him as, Abdu'l-Bahá insisted on being called the servant, and his name Abdu'l-Bahá means servant of Bahá, servant of Baha'u'llah, servant of the Baha'i faith. And also by doing this, he transforms for us the notion of a leader, because Abdu'l-Bahá was appointed to be the leader of the Baha'i faith following the death of Baha'u'llah. Unlike all religions in the past, Baha'u'llah left a will and testament, and he very clearly designated Abdu'l-Bahá as his successor. So he was the leader of the Baha'i faith. But he insisted on being called a servant, and he viewed his leadership in servitude. He was a servant leader. And of course, Greenleaf, who wrote management books on servant leadership, I don't know that he ever knew Abdu'l-Bahá, but this idea of servant leadership, I would argue Abdu'l-Bahá first embodied in the late 1800s and in the early 1900s. So what I want to do is look very tactically and strategically at some of the qualities that Abdu'l-Bahá embodied that reflect this current needed style of leadership and future predicted style of leadership that we should all be modeling and trying to reflect. So I'm going to share my screen. I'm going to share a few quotes and some visuals. So what I was talking about before about the historic evolution of leadership, we have some interesting quotations in the Baha'i writings that reflect this. We're told that if long-cherished ideals and time-honored institutions, if certain social assumptions and religious formulae have ceased to promote the welfare of the generality of mankind, if they no longer minister to the needs of a continually evolving humanity, let them be swept away and relegated to the limbo of obsolescent and forgotten doctrine. Why should these, in a world subject to the immutable law of change and decay, be exempt from the deterioration that must needs overtake every human institution? For legal standards, political, and economic theories are solely designed to safeguard the interests of humanity as a whole, and not humanity to be crucified for the preservation of the integrity of any particular law or doctrine. As a lawyer myself, I love this quote very much, because in the United States, for example, people have put the Constitution frozen in time and kind of almost consider it like a wholly immovable, unchangeable doctrine. And, you know, the writings really confirm that that should not be the case. We should evolve, and we should, in fact, get rid of things that really don't serve all of humanity. Similarly, the Universal House of Justice, which is the international governing body of the Baha'is, in 2017, said there is no justification for continuing to perpetuate structures, rules, and systems that manifestly fail to serve the interests of all people. So, but this process of the evolution of management structures, leadership structures, is not peaceful. It's not pretty. It's actually, change of any kind is very painful. And so we're also warned that we're witnessing the confusion and breakdown of human institutions, and the ensuing epoch during which the shattered basis of a dismembered society, very violent references, is to be recast and its forces reshaped, redirected, and unified. So we know that leadership, both practices and structure, has to change. We've talked about who Abdu'l-Bahá is. So what I'm going to do is talk about these following things. So based on the example of Abdu'l-Bahá, he shows us that leadership will redefine power. It will be more feminine. It will be less adversarial, more consultative. It will be self-aware of privilege and power. It will be rooted in love. It will be found through unity. It will be humble. It will be a channel for divine influence. It won't be I or me focused. And then we'll also spend some time talking about public communication, how he gave speeches, which of course is a really important quality of leadership. And Abdu'l-Bahá did it with a science as well as an art. And we'll talk more about some of the elements of that as effective leadership. I'll show this slide to you at the very beginning as at the end of as a summary as well, but this is a preview of what we'll be talking about. So first, Abdu'l-Bahá shows us that leadership will embrace new concepts of power. The Universal House of Justice talked very specifically about this in ways that I thought were incredibly eloquent. They talked about how humanity, having passed through earlier stages of social evolution, stands at the threshold of its collective maturity. Its belief that the principle of the oneness of humankind, the hallmark of the age of maturity, implies a change in the very structure of society. Its dedication to a learning process that is animated by this principle explores the working of a new set of relationships among the individual, the community, and institutions of society. The three protagonists in the advancement of civilization, its confidence that a revised conception of power, freed from the notion of dominance, with the accompanying ideas of contest, contention, division, and superiority, underlies the desired set of relationships to its commitment to a vision of a world that, benefiting from humanity's rich cultural diversity, abides no lines of separation. These all constitute essential elements of the framework that shape the Baha'i approach to politics. If the web of relationships alluded to above is to take shape and give rise to a pattern of life distinguished by adherence to the principle of the oneness of humankind, certain foundational concepts must be carefully examined. Most notable among them is the conception of power. Clearly, the concept of power as a means of domination, with the accompanying notions of contest, contention, division, and superiority, must be left behind. This is not to deny the operation of power. After all, even in cases where institutions of society have received their mandates through the consent of the people, power is involved in the exercise of authority. Associated with power in this sense are words such as release, encourage, channel, guide, and enable. Power is not a finite entity which is to be seized and jealously guarded. It constitutes a limitless capacity to transform that resides in the human race as a body. And so people who were around Abdu'l-Bahá saw these qualities in Abdu'l-Bahá. They saw how he would be very encouraging. He would be very loving. He would channel and he would guide, but he wouldn't dominate or take control. And so these concepts of leadership and a redefinition of power is seen not only in these quotes, but also in his example. We're also told that Abdu'l-Bahá says that the world in the past has been ruled by force, and man has dominated over woman by reason of his more forceful and aggressive qualities, both of body and mind. But the balance is already shifting. Force is losing its dominance, and mental alertness, intuition, and the spiritual qualities of love and service in which women are strong are gaining ascendancy. Hence, the new age will be an age less masculine and more permeated with feminine ideals. Or, to speak more exactly, it will be an age in which the masculine and feminine elements of civilization will be more balanced. And people who were around Abdu'l-Bahá saw these qualities. In one example, Abdu'l-Bahá, and I'm actually just going to stop staring my screen really quickly. Emotion for much of human history was denied and squashed in men. And part of that was very functional because men, for much of history, one of their primary functions was protection, and there was a lot of war. There was a lot of combat. And, when you look at early human history, physical defense was like a daily engagement, and men engaged in war almost constantly. And so the idea that you needed to not feel deeply, have a lot of compassion, be very sympathetic, cry when you see blood or when you see pain or when you see death was something that was deconditioned pretty systematically out of men. in ways that were tragic and in fact resulted in a lot of mental health issues and PTSD and all kinds of things that we're now coming to appreciate. So it was never healthy, but it was functional. And society did this to men and to boys. Boys don't cry or have a stiff upper lip, man up, get over it. All of these kinds of sayings were really imposed on men. And fortunately, today we're coming to appreciate the negativity and the toxic masculinity that reflects, but also the beauty of emotion and the beauty of compassion and the beauty of some of those qualities that were previously seen as weak, or soft or problematic, in fact, for men whose primary job was to defend their family and to defend the country. And so Abdu'l-Bahá is, recognizing that shift. One of the stories that I really appreciated about Abdu'l-Bahá was, we're told in the Baha'i writings that tests are a gift and that we should be detached from wanting our way or wanting things to work out a certain way, or detached to a degree from disappointment and frustration and all of these kinds of things. In my immature understanding of that, and I struggle like everybody else to understand how to endure tests with detachment, and how to see them positively. And in my immature understanding of that, I think I thought it required almost kind of a mechanical detachment from emotion, almost a sociopathic detachment from emotion. Like, okay, I'm going to face this test in life, but I'm not going to feel it. I'm not going to be affected by it. I'm going to be detached from it. And so, in my immature understanding, I almost kind of felt like I had to emotionally detach. And until I heard this story of Abdu'l-Bahá, so some of you may be aware that there was a pretty long period of time when Abdu'l-Bahá was really being persecuted by his own family, by his brothers, and it followed the death of Baha'u'llah. And so Abdu'l-Bahá was already sad. He was devastated. He was mourning. And to make matters worse, his half brothers confiscated all of Baha'u'llah's belongings, all of his assets, all of the money of the family, and all many, many things. And in fact, did not allow Abdu'l-Bahá to even visit the grave of his own father. And it was just a very, very sad time. And on top of that, they tried to kill him a few times. They spread lies and rumors. They wrote government officials to try to spread lies about Abdu'l-Bahá and also to get him executed. So horrible stuff was happening. And Abdu'l-Bahá never discussed it. He never talked about it. He never spoke badly about his brothers. He never estranged himself. And like even when they tried to kill him, like he never retaliated. He still invited them to his daughter's wedding. I mean, it was like an incredible degree of unconditional love and not talking about it and detachment. But pilgrims who were with Abdu'l-Bahá during that time, and he would receive pilgrims from the West and from other parts of the country or other parts of the world. During this exact period of time, there were pilgrims who described Abdu'l-Bahá during the day as being very attentive to their needs, very focused on them, and not at all speaking about his pain or his difficulties. But at night, they would hear him wailing and crying in his room. And they would hear him beseeching to God loudly for mercy and for compassion from these tests. That really moved me because what it told me was Abdu'l-Bahá felt like he did not feel what was happening to him. He felt it deeply. He was in pain. He didn't have a sociopathic like separation or non-feeling from what was happening. He just compartmentalized it. During the day, he was able to interact with people in a certain way. And then at night, he emoted and he felt. And, I have to also wonder, having been on pilgrimage, and many of you have, being in the homes where Abdu'l-Bahá and his family were, the walls were thin, the floors were made of wood. And I have to think on some level that Abdu'l-Bahá might have known that pilgrims could hear him because wailing, like that word wailing, that's not quiet. That's not like crying into your pillow. That's publicly wailing. And so I also wonder if Abdu'l-Bahá, in his wisdom, in his own leadership, wanted to make people know he felt, and that feeling was okay. We could feel, and we should embrace that. But at the same time, it's an act of leadership to know kind of when and where to show your vulnerability and to show your weakness or to show your emotion, and that there is a place to do that, in fact, as a leader. And there's a place to be vulnerable and there's a place to have emotion. But Abdu'l-Bahá exemplified kind of the when and the where around that. And then for me, that story was really helpful because it helped me realize that even as I was facing tests or difficulties, it wasn't that I couldn't feel the pain, that I shouldn't feel the emotion. Like it's okay to be sad and it's okay to wail at night, or whatever. But maybe not dump it on everyone, for example. And so he shows us through his example how to do that. Okay, so I'm going to continue with some of these other qualities. So we also know, and I'm going to share my screen again. We also know that leadership will not be adversarial. So in today's political system, in many companies today, leadership is battle and it's adversarial, and it's about shooting down the ideas of others or even taking them on for yourself, claiming credit, proving you're better, you're more. It's adversarial, basically. And we're told in the Baha'i writings that unity and cooperation are the important values which should be the watchword for activities in which the believers engage. As a consequence, Baha'is eschew the adversarial approach of dispute and confrontation and seek rather the methods of consultation, with its commitment to informed discussion and mutual respect, and with its goal, the achievement of consensus in the pursuit of truth. Baha'is aim to persuade others of the correctness of their views through their example and the use of reason, and shun techniques of pressure, condemnation, and abuse, which are a deplorable feature of much of present day quest for social justice. And so we can see this in leadership qualities too. Some leaders do pressure, condemn, and even abuse people who work for them, but we're told that that should not be the case. And then another quality of leadership is self-awareness. So we're told to be self-aware in many places in the writings. So one of the hidden words says that we should take ourselves into account each day, for death unheralded shall come upon thee, and thou shalt be called to give account for thy deeds. And so we're told, like, hold ourselves account, be self-aware. Also, Shoghi Effendi, in the context of racism, says, let the white make a supreme effort in their resolve to contribute to their share of the solution of this problem, which is racism, to abandon once and for all their usually inherent and at times subconscious sense of superiority, and to correct their tendency towards a patronizing attitude towards the members of the other race. So this is all telling us, be aware, particularly if we have privilege. In this case, if we're white, but in other instances, perhaps if you're a man in a room, or whatever privilege exists, and people have lots of different types of privilege, but we need to be self-aware. So Abdu'l-Bahá was incredibly self-aware of his own privilege. And in one example, so you may know that Abdu'l-Bahá and his family, I'm just going to stop sharing the screen again for a moment. But Abdu'l-Bahá and his family were prisoners. Abdu'l-Bahá was a prisoner for most of his life, and only released very late in age. And there were different phases to that imprisonment. But during the beginning years, it was particularly brutal, lots of torture, lots of starvation, incarceration, very, very brutal for both the family, but also for those believers who traveled with them. And when they arrived in Akka, which at that time was part of the Ottoman Empire, the Turkish Empire, it was a prison city. And it was described as so deplorable that birds, when flying overhead, would drop dead because of the stench and the smell of the city. It was a very horrible place with not great people in it. And so Baha'u'llah, yes, and his family, but particularly Abdu'l-Bahá, were all held in prison. So in this particular time, Baha'u'llah was put in solitary confinement, and the rest of the Baha'is were all put in one room together. And the conditions were very bad. So these are the words of Abdu'l-Bahá. He said, aside from the severe illness that was raging and the deaths of many prisoners, adults and children, on account of the unsanitary surroundings and starvation, I noticed that my own presence in that crowded room was another source of torture to all of them. This was due to the fact that parents and children were suppressing and restraining themselves by trying to be quiet and polite in my presence. So, as a leader, he understood I have power and privilege, and others are navigating what I think of them. So he had that self-awareness about what his power and his privilege did in that environment. So then he said, so in order to give them freedom, I accepted the morgue in the barracks as it was the only room available. And I lived in it for 2 years. Okay. Now, they didn't have electricity back then. There was not refrigeration back then. I don't know what morgues look like. I don't know how they kept bodies, but we know that that's where bodies were kept, in the morgue. And so Baha'u'llah slept next to unrefrigerated dead bodies for 2 years in order to make others more comfortable. So again, like as an act of leadership, who was very self-aware of his own power and his own privilege, and chose those circumstances for himself as a way to give relief to others. It's, again, an incredible example of leadership, where many leaders today kind of take the privilege of whatever the office looks like, maybe, or whatever, as opposed to suffering not only with others but even more than others. Okay, so then another quality of leadership has to do with the transformative power of love. And we're told there was a message from the Universal House of Justice relatively recently, in 2020, that reminded of this, and said, ultimately, the power to transform the world is affected by love. And this makes perfect sense, because we're also told that no man can attain his true station except through his justice. No power can exist except through unity. No welfare and no well-being can be attained except through consultation. So we know that power is through unity. It's through justice, because we're told elsewhere in the Baha'i writings that the purpose of justice is the appearance of unity. And the word appearance in translation, because a Persian friend told me that the original word was the word used to describe the rising of the sun in the morning. So where in English appearance can mean facade, or it can mean emergence, the gradual emergence of something. In this context, the purpose of justice is the appearance or the gradual emergence of unity. And so we know that this all has to happen. This is largely controlled by leaders. Whether in an organization there is justice, whether there is consultation happening in an organization, whether it's executed in a spirit of love, and whether it results in unity, which are all how we're going to have power, is what the writings tell us. That is largely designed, heavily influenced, and controlled by leaders. And so embodying these qualities is very, very important. And everyone who was around Abdu'l-Bahá described feeling deep love from him. Love that was energetic, like they felt this just energy of love, as well as in his actions and in his words. We also know that leadership needs to be humble. The writings say, why do you elevate yourself when you're all created from the same dust? We're also told not to belittle anyone else or call them ignorant. We can't say, you know not, but I know, because rather we should look upon all others with respect. Um, and we should be careful of pride. A teacher shouldn't see himself as superior. All of these things. This is what we're told. So we know that humility will be very, very important. Abdu'l-Bahá told sorry, there in Anna Marie in vignettes from the life of Abdu'l-Bahá reflects a story where he says once when a child asked him why all the rivers of the earth flow into the ocean, he said it's because it sets itself lower than them all, and so it draws them to itself. And so this is a very beautiful analogy. The ocean, of course, is powerful and it covers the whole world. But rivers flow into it because it sets itself lower. And so everything flows into it. And so again, he was talking about that as an example of leadership, that is what will draw people to other people. We also know that it will be through God's grace, that leadership is granted through God's grace, that any qualities of strength, any qualities of intelligence, any luck of fortune that gives people positions of power are not because of our inherent superiority or intellect or anything like that. It's because God grants it. And I think this is a really important perspective because it helps detach the ego from any accomplishments, understanding that they're simply an act of divine mercy or gift. So Abdu'l-Bahá said that it is from the bounty of God that man is selected for the highest degree. And the differences which exist between men in regard to spiritual progress and heavenly perfections are also due to the choice of the compassionate one. Nevertheless, by effort and perseverance, knowledge, science, and other perfections can be acquired, but only the light of divine beauty can transport and move the spirits through the force of attraction. Therefore, it is said, many are called, but few are chosen. So in this quote, he kind of balances yes, you have to exert effort. You have to persevere. You have to have knowledge, science, acquire perfections, all of these things. But it's really only through the light of divine beauty that you will be able to use those things or even develop those things for a higher purpose or to advance. So the role of God's grace here is very, very important. Reflecting God's grace is a really fun story, I think, from Abdu'l-Bahá. When Abdu'l-Bahá was released very late in life from being a prisoner, he immediately started to travel the world. And he went around teaching the faith. He went to Europe, first went to Egypt, and then he went to Paris, and then he went all over Europe, and then he went to the United States as well. But his schedule was grueling. Like the people around him were often completely exhausted by him because he would wake up early. He would often engage in service. He would help the poor. Then he would meet with people. He would give speeches. He had a really, really grueling schedule. And he was old. I mean, he was considered elderly, and but he had this youthful energy. Now he did keep himself in shape. Stories are that he swam regularly in the oceans around Akka as a way to keep in shape. And so, rather than an act of vanity, it was really a way to keep his stamina up so that when he had the opportunity to serve, he could serve with energy and with strength. But he was in shape and he put others to shame who were often younger than him. And so this story is kind of funny to me, but It's in The Chosen Highway by Lady Bloomfield. She says, one day after a meeting, when as usual many people had crowded around him, Abdu'l-Bahá arrived home very tired. We were sad at heart that he should be so fatigued, and bewailed the many steps to be ascended to the top of the flat. Suddenly, to our amazement, the master ran up the stairs to the top very quickly without stopping. He looked down at us as we walked up after him, saying with a bright smile, from which all traces of fatigue had vanished. You are all very old, and I am very young. Seeing me full of wonder, Abdu'l-Bahá said, through the power of Baha'u'llah, all things can be done, and I have just used that power. It's like he's like saying, through the grace of God, like I just activated it and I ran up the stairs. That was the only time we had ever seen him use that power for himself. This is kind of very interesting. And I feel that he did so then to cheer and comfort us as we were really sad concerning his fatigue. Might it not also have been to show us an example of the great reserve of divine force always available for those who are working in various ways in the path of the love of God and of mankind, a celestial strength which reinforces us when our human strength fails. And so Abdu'l-Bahá would channel this divine strength. Okay. And then another thing that we know about leadership through the example of Abdu'l-Bahá is that it will not be I focused. So here I'm again going to stop sharing my screen. Whether it's politicians or sometimes leaders and managers, there can be a lot of kind of me, or I language used. And Abdu'l-Bahá was actually very allergic to this language and had very strong reactions in response to it. So, for example, I'll give you two examples of this. One example is that people used to, out of complete love for Abdu'l-Bahá, people used to write poems about him, and they would send letters praising him and all of these kinds of things. But people who worked around him, like maybe worked in his household or whatever, kind of knew that these letters brought Abdu'l-Bahá sadness. And they didn't share them with him because they knew he didn't like it, basically. But I'm going to read to you a story about this incident. Baha'i poets and people of letters in Persia used to write poems in praise and glorification of Abdu'l-Bahá. But the resident Baha'is in Akka, again, this prison city where they were very careful not to breathe a word about his glorious station. They knew he had often advised the poets that instead of singing his praise, they ought to exalt his station of servitude and utter self-effacement. One day, a laudatory letter arrived, meaning a letter that praised him. It was addressed to Abdu'l-Bahá, composed in verse, so it was probably a poem of some kind. Yunus Khan, who was serving Abdu'l-Bahá at the time, handed the poem to Abdu'l-Bahá as he was coming down the steps of the house in front of the sea. It appeared the right moment to give it to him. He hardly read one or two lines when he suddenly turned his face towards Yunus Khan and with the utmost sadness and a deep sense of grief said, "Now even you hand me letters such as this? Don't you know the measure of pain and sorrow which overtakes me when I hear people addressing me with such exalted titles? Even you have not recognized me. I consider myself lowlier than each and every one of the loved ones of the Blessed Beauty." So he hated this so much that he chastised, like pretty brutally, I think, chastised a person who served him every day. So he had a very strong, negative reaction and a corrective response to receiving words of praise. In another story, this was when Abdu'l-Bahá was in America, and they were driving. Lua Getzinger and George Ralston were driving with the master somewhere, and I guess it was taking a long time, and the master was tired, and he was in the back seat, and he decided to fall asleep. And so Lua Getzinger and George thought Abdu'l-Bahá was asleep, and that he didn't hear anything that they were saying. And they thought that he had fallen asleep. They talked on and on, probably about their own concerns. And suddenly the master's eyes sprang open and he laughed and yelled, I, me, my, mine, words of the devil. So this is what he said. It must have been very shocking for them. Like here they are having their own conversation, talking about their own me, my, mine stuff. And Abdu'l-Bahá is in the back listening the whole time and decides to correct them basically and wakes up and, yells this with laughter. So I think he was trying to maybe bring them comfort, but he was calling them out at the same time. And saying, I, me, mine, these are all words of the devil. And in other stories, people have heard Abdu'l-Bahá say that he said that these will become like curse words in the future. And that people will refrain from using them. So it's a completely different orientation, right? Because particularly in the West, we have very much a I, me, mine orientation. Me time. This is mine. I own it. My needs. Whatever. Like there are all of these concepts that are very me focused. But Abdu'l-Bahá modeled a very different example, which was of utter self-effacement, selflessness to the point of self-detriment. When he exercised, it wasn't me time. It was get strong for service time. It's just very different orientation. Okay. So now we're going to talk about effective communication. So effective communication is one of the most important skills that leaders exhibit. They have to be able to communicate often and with a lot of people. And we're told that effective communication is very, very important. Actually, I'm going to jump ahead to okay. So the importance of speech. Baha'u'llah says, if it be our pleasure, and by the way, whenever there is kind of a first person, particularly plural reference that is capitalized, this is where Baha'u'llah is talking about him as a mouthpiece from God. So he's talking about the divine. He said, if it be our pleasure, we shall render the cause victorious through the power of a single word from our presence. He is in truth the omnipotent, the all-compelling. Should it be God's intention, there would appear out of the forests of celestial might the lion of indomitable strength, whose roaring is like unto the peals of thunder, reverberating in the mountains. However, since our loving providence surpasseth all things, we have ordained that complete victory should be achieved through speech and utterance, that our servants throughout the earth may thereby become the recipients of divine good. This is but a token of God's bounty vouchsafed unto them. So here, Baha'u'llah is basically saying, oh wait, am I not sharing my screen? Sorry. Let me share my screen so you have the reference. Okay. So here, for those of you who might want the reference, this is the reference of that quotation. So here, basically, Baha'u'llah is kind of saying, I could do this on my own. He's like, if I wanted to, out of a single word of my presence, I could transform the planet. If I want, make a lion appear from the forest who would change everything. I could do that if I want. However, since our loving providence surpasseth all things, we have ordained that victory will be achieved through speech and utterance. And so this is the tool. This is the tool that we're given in order to transform society. So it matters. Like we should think a lot about it. We should be intentional. We should adopt methods and approaches that will lead to our success, in transforming people through speech. So what I'm going to share over the next few minutes before we break for questions is how Abdu'l-Bahá communicated and how he gave speeches. And he did very specific things that are science backed. And so I'm going to share with you the science behind it, and I'm going to share with you what Abdu'l-Bahá did. And he was really good at his physical presence. He was really good at eye contact. He was really good at hand gestures. He was very intentional about his voice. He was also strategic about channeling divine inspiration and guidance. And he had a very specific formulaic structure to all of his speeches that he used again and again and again. Okay, so we're gonna talk about all of those elements. So first, his physical presence. And by the way, there's science around this. So it takes 15 seconds to make a first impression. So like when you're standing up to a podium or, starting to speak in a staff meeting or wherever your leadership moment is, you have 15 seconds to make your first impression. And according to a study done by UCLA, 57% of communication during presentations is nonverbal. 36% is your voice, and only 7% are your words. And a lot of people think it's my words, and that's why they write out their speeches and why they think reading it is a good idea, but it's not. And the science tells us that because it's only 7% your words. Also, in terms of physical presence, there's this thing called power posing. It's kind of interesting. There's like a interesting TED Talk about it where you can Google it if you want. But power posing is when you have like open arms. You have you can put your hands on your hips. That's a power pose. Having a straight back, wide shoulders. All of that increases confidence, reduces stress. It increases testosterone, reduces cortisone. This is all scientifically proven. So your physicality and your physical presence actually affects both what's going on inside of you chemically and psychologically, but also how people receive you. So Edward Granville Brown, who spent a lot of time, he was a historian from the UK. He spent a lot of time with Abdu'l-Bahá, and he said this about Abdu'l-Bahā's physical presence. Seldom have I seen one whose appearance impressed me more. Subsequent conversation with him served only to heighten the respect with which his appearance had from the first inspired me. One more eloquent of speech, more ready of argument, more apt of illustration. So here, these are like elements of good speech, right? He was eloquent, he had good arguments, and he had good illustrations, stories, drawings, analogies, right? These are all illustrations. Could, I should think, scarcely be found. These qualities combined with a bearing at once majestic and genial made me cease to wonder at the influence and esteem which he enjoyed. About the greatness of this man and his power, no one who had seen him could entertain a doubt. So he had a physical presence that was effective and that exuded power and influence. Another observer said that he was strongly and solidly built. So this made an impression on people. Even his weight, they observed, weighing about 165 pounds. That's very specific. I don't know how they knew 165, but anyway, as opposed to something more rounded. Adding that he was alert and active in every movement. His head thrown back and splendidly poised upon his broad, square shoulders. Another described him as having perfect symmetry and being full of dignity and grace. So these physical attributes impacted people. Abdu'l-Bahá's family was taught to dress in a manner that would be an example to the rich and an encouragement to the poor. So this is very interesting because people will often say, well, how should I dress? You know what I mean? Like when I'm giving a speech or I'm walking into a meeting, do you be fancy? Are you dressing lowly? What is it? What is it? And this I thought was really, really interesting guidance. Be an example to the rich and an encouragement to the poor. And so that's subjective, of course, but one might want to get feedback. I know often when I'm speaking to an audience, I will have a pre-conversation to tell me who the audience is and what their background is, and then as best as I can to try to assess what will make them comfortable in terms of, how I dress. If it's a room of lawyers, I usually wear a suit. If it's a different room, I'll wear something very different. But again, trying to be responsive to the audience. Okay, physical presence. Eye contact. This is kind of interesting, I think. So studies have shown that to be effective, eye contact must last for 3 seconds. So when you're thinking, and it's kind of fun to try to practice that on people, it might feel weird to you, but when you look at somebody and you count 1, 2, 3 before you look away, it matters rather than looking at someone for a second and then looking away and then looking away and looking away, right? There's a different kind of connection that you have with somebody when you give that 3-second pause. There's also it's an illusion. It's an optical illusion, basically, that you can create when you're giving a speech by dividing the room into thirds and speaking, again, using that 3, but sometimes 5-second rule to each third of the room. It's also very helpful to pick a friendly face and to actually speak to one person to your left, one person to your middle, and one person to your right. And it helps you as a speaker when you can see that face because it makes it feel more personal and comfortable. But it gives the audience an illusion that you're talking to them personally. And so they've done, AI generated studies around facial movement and eye contact of speakers who were considered effective, and they use this formula. And then that previous study from UCLA about communication during presentations is, 57% is nonverbal. It has to do with your body, your gestures, your eye contact, kind of all of these things that are nonverbal. And then Abdu'l-Bahá, very specifically, observers spoke of him and said that he seems to look at each member of the audience. And so I'm guessing he employed some of these tactics that make people feel like they're all being looked at. One found that in his eyes, a living flame, which seemed to ignite a smoldering spark within me. Another added that they seemed to look into you instead of at you, with an expression that is alert, intelligent, and serene. There was another recounting. I'm actually going to make a note of this because I want to put this in the presentation for future. He never read his speeches, and people talked about that. And this has to do with eye contact, because you cannot read a speech and maintain eye contact unless you have a teleprompter that has it's clear, and so the audience thinks you're looking at them, but you're really reading a teleprompter. Unless you've got that set up, you cannot look down at your podium and have an audience think that you're connecting with them. So you cannot, don't read your speech. It's very, very important. And Abdu'l-Bahá never did. Okay. So then another quality was hand gestures. Abdu'l-Bahá was very skilled at how he used hand gestures. So research suggests that hand gestures can help listeners understand speech more accurately and can make a speaker seem more compelling. For example, a study found that participants were 20% more likely to hear and interpret words when accompanied by a matching hand gesture. Another study found that speakers in the most popular TED Talks used 465 hand gestures, while speakers in their least popular TED Talks used 272. So there's like this proportionality with hand gestures. There's also a really fun, if you Google it, it's a TED Talk on how to give a TED Talk. But what the guy does is he talks about nothing. He says, I'm going to tell you nothing, and I'm going to talk about nothing, and I'm going to speak about nothing. But the way he does it is so compelling, and it makes you really realize that you could be completely drawn into somebody who really is truly saying nothing just because of the way they're saying it. It's a really good lesson on public speaking. So people described Abdu'l-Bahá's gestures as being an encouraging upward swing of the hands. And this is very interesting because not all hand gestures are created equal. But Abdu'l-Bahá used an encouraging upward swing of hands with never an upraised warning finger or a downward stroke. Very specific. It's very fascinating to me, these like nuanced elements of Abdu'l-Bahá and how he spoke. Okay. And then his voice. So the science tells us that voice intonation was responsible for 38% of a speaker's effectiveness. And the speaker's words were responsible for only 7%. Okay, so we knew that nonverbal was 57%. It's voice intonation. That's the 38%. And, if you think of music, for example, like songs that you like, they have crescendo, they have moments of silence, the beat and the music goes up and down. It's the diversity that makes it pleasing to the ear. And so it's the same with speeches. With regard to the example of Abdu'l-Bahá, Elbert Hubbard wrote in Hearst magazine that Abdu'l-Bahá listens with much appreciation and sympathy, that he speaks slowly, distinctively, and most impressively. Hubbard concluded he knows what he is saying. His heart is full and his emotions are brimming, although kept well under control. So this is very interesting. His speech shared emotion, like it had passion, but it was controlled. Also, this same person said his voice filled the room, no matter how large or small, but he wasn't overly loud. So this is also a very interesting thing. Like Abdu'l-Bahá had the projection capacity to fill a room with his voice without being overly loud. Okay. And then channeling divine intervention. Dorothy Baker was known as an amazing public speaker, one of the best public speakers in Baha'i history. She lived in the early 1900s, and there's a wonderful book about her called Copper to Gold, which talked about her speeches and talked about her methodology for giving speeches. She was very intentional about how she did it. Abdu'l-Bahá gave advice to Dorothy Baker on how to give speeches effectively. And what he said to her was, speak, therefore, speak out with great courage at every meeting. When thou art about to begin thine address, turn first to Baha'u'llah and ask for the confirmations of the Holy Spirit. Then open thy lips and say whatever is suggested to thy heart. This, however, with the utmost courage, dignity, and conviction. It is my hope that from day to day your gatherings will grow and flourish, and that those who are seeking after truth will hearken therein to reasoned arguments and conclusive proofs. I am with you, heart and soul, at every meeting. Be sure of this. So really specific advice on how to give speeches, arguments, and proofs, to have courage, be dignified, speak with conviction, right? Like all of these very, very specific things, but also to turn to Baha'u'llah right before giving a speech to channel divine intervention. And he gave her a specific prayer, and she said this prayer before every speech. And the prayer is, praised be to thee, O my God. Thou hast guided me to the horizon of thy manifestation and made me known through thy name. I beg of thee by the radiant light of thy gifts and by the waves of thy beneficence to endow my utterance with inspiration from the traces of thy supreme pen, that it may attract the realities of all things. Verily, thou art the one who is powerful in all that he wills by his word, the mighty, the wonderful. This is a prayer that I try to say before every speech that I give. And it's one of these beautiful tools that we're given to help us in those moments when we're attempting to do that. Okay, so now we're going to talk about structure. So, kind of the outline, basically, of a speech. And there was a very specific outline that Abdu'l-Bahá followed. And this outline is reinforced by current science around what works well for speeches. So, um, so the very first thing that Abdu'l-Bahá would do is he would appreciate his audience. That was the very first thing he would always do. And this, even like when people are training salespeople and how to be salespeople, it's a similar science. It's like always make sure the person feels seen. That's like the first thing you should do. And Abdu'l-Bahá did this in his speeches. The first thing he would do was compliment the audience. He would research them, he would find out about them. And the very first thing he would do would compliment them, and he would tell them who they were as an audience. And it was a way of saying, I see you. I see you and I love you and I appreciate you. And the minute that happens, people's hearts open. We've all experienced that maybe in our own lives, that when people in front of us really see us, seem to know us, and seem to appreciate us, it makes us very receptive to what they say. And so Abdu'l-Bahá would do this. And in one example, there's two speeches that I really like. One was the philosophical or theosophical, that was called Theosophical Society in Paris. And he said, since my arrival in Paris, I have been told of the Theosophical Society, and I know that it is composed of honored and respected men. He's saying, like, you are amazing, and I've been told how wonderful you are. You are men of intellect and thought, men with inspirational ideals. And it is a great pleasure for me to be among you, right? So this is the first thing he says to them. Also, he gave a talk at Howard University. And similarly, the very first thing he did when he began his talk was he said, today I am most happy, for I see here a gathering of the servants of God. He's like, this is what I see in you. I think you're amazing. I think you're wonderful. And this is who I see in the audience. And then he said, I see white and black sitting together. There are no whites and blacks before God. All colors are one. And that is the color of servitude to God. And then he kind of goes on to talk about racial unity. So I'm going to share my screen again. So he always opened up his speeches this way. He appreciated the audience. We're also told there is a hidden word that says, love thee so that I may love thee. If thou lovest me not, my love can in no wise reach thee. And it's this idea of mutuality. When we love people, they can love us better. And, here in front of an audience, Abdu'l-Bahá exemplified, he took that first step of love. He says, I love thee so that you can love me. It's kind of this mutual, reciprocal, but also very effective. So the very first thing you should do when you're giving a speech is see the people in the audience, appreciate them, and let them know that you know them. Then you tell them what you're going to tell them. Then you tell them what you told them. So this is the outline of every good speech. Preview what they're about to hear about, then tell them, but then tell them what you told them. And in terms of telling them, there's another sub-formula, which is have your key idea. And it's better to have one key idea, but no more than 3 if you're going to address multiple topics. But then talk about it with supporting examples, illustrations, explanations, and quotations. So again, the science behind this is that if you speak to people and just tell them facts, there is only a 5 to 10% retention rate of the information. If you add visual materials and images, then retention can increase to 25 to 30%. But if you tell them a story with examples and emotion, and it is engaging, then retention increases to 65 to 75%. So this is science, right? But Abdu'l-Bahá did it very, very well. And then finally, you tell them what you told them. And so, Abdu'l-Bahá would often tell stories. He would often use illustrations. He was very good at making sure that his points were understood through storytelling. Sometimes he would use scientific explanations of things, and that kind of thing. So, yeah, there was one recollection of Abdu'l-Bahá where they said his presentations began with brief introductions, often noting something in the environment or the audience. And then he moved to his key idea. He supported his central theme in varieties of ways with examples, illustrations, explanations, and quotations. And he used arguments based on both inductive and deductive reasoning. So this is again, people really examined how he spoke. He used inductive and deductive reasoning. Then Baha'u'llah tells us that the sanctified souls should ponder and meditate in their hearts regarding the methods of teaching from the texts of wondrous heavenly scripture. They should memorize phrases and passages bearing on various instances, so that in the course of their speech, they may recite divine verses whenever the occasion demands it. So Baha'u'llah, this is Baha'u'llah, and again, he's giving instruction about how to give speeches by using the writings in skilled ways. So we have all of this guidance that can help us. Then Abdu'l-Bahá would wrap it up and would remind people of his main points. So the tell them what you told them part. And then there was always a call to action, which is also important in speeches. Hoping that the audience will now go back and, Abdu'l-Bahá would often encourage people to further investigate the Baha'i faith, or he would encourage them to serve humanity, or he would encourage them to engage in interracial friendships. There was always a call to action at the end of his speeches about what he wanted people to do. Okay. So if I'm going to listen to my own advice, now I'm going to tell you what I told you. So what we did is we talked about leadership broadly using the example of Abdu'l-Bahá. And we learned that, it would involve, and using the example of Abdu'l-Bahá, we could see how he embodied these qualities of redefining power, being more feminine, less adversarial, being self-aware of power and privilege, being rooted in love, leadership being found through unity, being humble, being a channel of divine influence, and not being I-focused. And then we talked specifically about effective communication tactics, how to be aware of physical presence, use it effectively, eye contact, hand gestures, voice, also calling on divine inspiration and power in order to give a speech, but then also how to structure your speech, appreciate the audience, tell them what you're going to tell them what you told them, and give them a call to action. Okay. So that's what I got. And I couldn't see the chat while I was presenting, but I'll look at it now and see what questions, or maybe if, Pamene, if you want to tell me what you think. Yeah.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, thank you so much. That was a really insightful and in-depth, presentation on how we can be great presenters like yourself. Thank you. Okay, so some of the questions were, which pilgrim's writings do we find this information from, about his wailing grief?
So that was in Balyuzi's book about Abdu'l-Bahá. Yeah.
Great. What about female speakers' physiological changes?
What do you mean? I'm not sure I understand.
Yeah, if the person could expand on that, maybe. She said you commented on male speakers' bodily changes.
Male speakers' bodily changes. I didn't do that. I mean, I spoke about how having broad shoulders is helpful, but women can do that too. There's nothing kind of gendered about that. I mean, well, I spoke about, I mean, Abdu'l-Bahá, like How to Man's Body, so whatever. But the science is that power poses, so it's kind of like bringing your shoulders back, even putting your hands on your hips, things like that are effective. But it's effective for women as well as for men. So it's something that both men and women and how female speakers should be dressed. No, so I want to. I don't know why we're separating men and women right now. I did not do that. In my presentation, the rules apply the same to men and women. And somebody mentioned periods. It totally doesn't matter if you have a period or not. There's nothing different about that. So the science is the same. Women can be very effective speakers and have body language that is language of confidence. So so yeah, I don't know why I feel like there's a little bit of unconscious bias happening in the chat about like women's periods and women having real differences on this. I mean, women can show up differently. Sure, it's fine. And all humans can. I mean, people have personalities and they have differences. We all have cultural, nuances. Some people have, come from cultures where loudness and volume is a sign of love, and for others it's slowness and more. But both can be great public speakers. There's nothing particularly biased in that. But what the science tells us is that there are certain qualities. So, for example, the physical stuff. If we stand up straight, the science tells us that we exude confidence, where when we kind of go like this with our shoulders a little bit more huddled, or we're looking down, or we're fidgeting, like fidgeting with hair or fidgeting with things like this, that exudes lack of confidence. But that is true for men as well as it is true for women. Now, I mean, what may be a fair observation is that a lot of men have been given often more opportunities to exercise, like more leadership opportunities, more public speaking opportunities, and that on average, women have less practice with some of those things. And there are some cultural norms, like women not speaking unless spoken to, or being spoken over, or these kinds of things that might mean that women have to counter some of that in order to be effective communicators. But the science around what's effective doesn't change. Some of the barriers maybe change, and some of our own unconscious bias. People can be more hypercritical of women, for example, than men, more demanding of their physical appearance. And that has to do with societal bias around beauty privilege and beauty bias. So anyway, there are gendered realities, but the qualities that I discussed are not gendered, if that makes sense. Yeah. So let's see. Oh, referring to the UCLA study to correct posture increasing hormones. Yes, but women have testosterone too. So again, that study had to do with both men and women, and levels of testosterone that are emitted and lowered cortisol levels, which again, both men and women have. Yeah. So thanks for that clarification. Other. Oh, Helen, thank you for raising. Oh, I love that. Yes. Humor. I should have absolutely talked about that. That's a great suggestion. Abdu'l-Bahá did use humor very effectively, and joy was a very, very important part of his communication with people. Thank you for raising that. Um, even like the example of him running up the stairs, like he tried to make people laugh, which is also very true. Yeah. One of the things that I hope people take away is, I don't know, like intentionality around both public speaking and leadership, because I've often heard people say, well, they're just good, like they're just a good speaker, or they're just a good leader. But those are learned skills, and those can be developed, and they can be nurtured, and they can be trained. And I was I was with someone who gave a speech, and somebody turned to me about that person and said, God, they're just naturally a good speaker. And they were a really good storyteller. And that was, a big part of it. And this person came from very humble backgrounds, and he showed up very humbly, but nobody would even blink. Like he just grabbed everybody. He had this incredible capacity to grab everybody's attention. And the person next to me was like, God, they're just a natural, and I was like, uh, do you know that that person practices again and again and again, and they get paid $25,000 for every speech they give, and that is his full-time profession? Like, this is not just some natural. All good actors train so hard to be able to look like they're not actors, right? And so I think, in the Baha'i community, we're told by Baha'u'llah that it is through speech and utterance that we will transform society. So it is worth spending time and effort to really, really be intentional about how we communicate, and to think deeply about developing this skill. So then Women on the House of Justice has come up, which is always fun. So we can talk about that. Um, and oh, wait, Gary, are you coming back? Oh, no, you're making, okay. So I'll let you type what you're about to type, but let's just talk about Women on the House of Justice. Okay. So it's true that women are not on the House of Justice, and women serve in in every single other administrative, management, leadership, service role in the faith. Why women are not on the House of Justice, we do not know. And even Abdu'l-Bahá himself did not opine as to why. Abdu'l-Bahá himself did not opine as to why. All he said is that in the future, it will become as clear as the noonday sun. And so I think what that means for us as Baha'is is we need to stop opining, because it really irritates me when people start doing it. Because wherever people go with, like, somebody said something about periods, like, I can't help but be shocked by the reasons people give. And the reasons are coming from our own bias. And it's understandable, because the reasons are filling a void of no reasons being given. And so it's kind of like this human inclination when we don't have any information, or when we don't have reasons, we make stories in our head when we don't have other information, and we just decide to make up stories. Again, it's human. It's very human. We see something, but we don't have full information. It's a human quality to just fill in the gap with a story that we make up in our head. But we need to strain with every muscle in our mind to not do that here. Don't make up reasons. If Abdu'l-Bahá, who is the perfect exemplar, gave no reason and did not opine and simply said, be patient, it will become as clear as the noonday sun, then how can we, who are far less perfect and have far less reasoning capacities than Abdu'l-Bahá, even start to opine? So the bottom line is we don't know. And then, as a feminist Baha'i, I can acknowledge that it's a test, but I just accept it as a matter of faith. And for others, there are other issues that they might accept as a matter of faith. But the last thing I think I am entitled to do is to even begin to guess why, because Abdu'l-Bahá himself did not explain why. So that's all I'm going to say on the topic. And so let's see. And, the other thing is we have to, I talked earlier about the new construct of power and leadership. And in the Baha'i faith, particularly on gender equality, sameness is not what that means. And the Baha'i writings are very clear on this. So while we have gender equality, absolutely, we do not have sameness. We do not. What men's biological bodies can do and women's can do is not the same. Different capacities, different roles, different responsibilities. And yes, presence on the House of Justice is different. But that's not the same as saying that people have different worth or different levels of superiority. People can have different roles and still have equality. So I want to, okay, Gary, I'm going to go back to what you said. The dominant white male kind of, okay, John Wayne mindset, feels and the others deem other. I say more to particular person. I'm not sure I 100% understand but what it is, if this is kind of what you're saying, it is certainly true that there is white dominant culture. Some will call it white supremacy culture. We can call it patriarchy culture, but that for years and years and years, I mean, thousands of years, what was white and what was male has often defined what was power. And so some of those same qualities that might have been inherent or intuitive or even trained for white men who, again, positionally, historically, as a matter of fact, maintained a lot of roles of power, even today. So there is a default bias that those qualities and characteristics mean credibility or mean confidence. And so that is absolutely true. But what is really cool, I think, is, and frankly, TED as a platform has helped to do this. They have really welcomed different styles of communication, different styles of leadership. And so it's beginning to shift the narrative around what effective leadership might look like. But there are norms that are historically dominated by whiteness and maleness that we are all victim to and, having to conform to in order to be, to appear credible for a lot of audiences. So absolutely agree with that, if I understood the point. Yeah.
Well,
So I think we're at yeah, go ahead.
yes, we're at our time. Thank you so much for coming here today and sharing with us your thoughts. And our speaker next week will be Mr. Peter Terry, and he'll be talking about Baha'u'llah on the signs of the coming of age of humanity. So again, these talks are every Saturday at noon Eastern time, and I've put the link to our YouTube channel and mailing list in the chat. Thank you, everyone. Have a nice week. Bye.